So this is a video I found, Capitalism Reflects Wealth Distribution in the Economy. I thought this would be interesting. It's from a guy called Gary's Economics. I'm going to talk about wealth distribution. Now, a lot of people think the inequalities of capitalism are just a distribution problem, right? When there is a problem with distribution, but really it's a problem with production, right? Workers aren't paid the value that they create. They are working hours that are they're paid for a certain amount of hours, right? But then there's a certain amount of unpaid hours, which the capitalists take home as surplus value or take home as profit. So that exploitation in production, in the sphere of production, in the actual production process, is what allows for capitalists to accumulate, the accumulation of capital and wealth, which is what leads to the massive inequality in the distribution of wealth, right? So it's not just in where the resources are going, but it's in the relations of production themselves, which necessitate exploitation. It's the fact that the capitalist economy is based on the exploitation of wage laborers by capitalists, which then allows the capitalists to accumulate, and creates a society that's greatly unequal in terms of material wealth. So I haven't watched this video. I don't know if he's going to make an argument that wealth inequality under capitalism happens because of distribution or whatever. I don't know if it's going to be a Marxist argument or an anti-Marxist argument or what, but should be interesting to react with you guys. So let's do it.
Well, I've been thinking for a while we need to do one about capitalism because we get asked it a lot, right?
Sorry, I was muted. I said this is way too fast with the British accent. We got to go 1.25. This is a cool place to shoot a video. I like the view.
Well, I've been thinking for a while we need to do one about capitalism because we get asked it a lot, right? Yeah. Capitalism is the problem. Yeah. It's a bit frustrating for me because it's like, it's so non-specific. It's like, okay, well, yes.
Capitalism is a specific mode of production, though. So like I was explaining earlier, slavery in America was very capitalistic, right? It was based on market production, and the slave owners interacted and traded with capitalists directly. But it's not capitalism because it was based on different relations of production. It was based on the enslaver and the slave, who is legally considered to be the property of the enslaver. Right? Capitalism commodifies wage labor, not people, not the wage laborer himself. So you can't own people under capitalism. You can only own their labor, their human activity for certain portions of the day, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, or whatever, or more. Obviously you can, but so the capitalism is a very specific thing. It's a system based on wage labor, and that develops and has to develop and overtake other modes of production. Like there are semi-feudal modes of production, like Russia when they had the revolution, right? Capitalism had not fully developed. It hadn't fully taken hold of the country. There were still peasants and landlords that that were more akin to the feudal mode of production, where you produce your own things, food that you need to survive, and then give the rest to the landlord or the feudal lord. So capitalism develops and takes hold, but it's a very specific mode of production. It's a very specific system based on a very specific relation of production. It's not the feudal landlord and the serf or the peasant. It's not the slave owner and the slave. It's the capitalist and the wage laborer who sells his wage labor sells his labor on the market as a commodity to the capitalist. Whereas slavery, like I said, humans are sold on the market as property. Not how capitalism works. In capitalism, you sell your wage labor to someone. So it is a very specific thing.
Problem with capitalism is different people have very, very different ideas of what the word means, right? So it can become difficult to do any sort of analysis of it because different people have different ideas. So I'm going to say, provide the basic working definition, which some people disagree with, but it's what I'm going to use for this purpose of this discussion, which is capitalism is a system which has a relatively small government, relatively low taxation. People.
So I already disagree with that definition, right? Because I don't think it has anything to do with the government. The government under a capitalist society will act as a dictatorship of capital, right? The ruling class will control the government in any society, just like the slave owners in the American South controlled the government in the Confederacy and in the southern states. And the feudal landlords and the aristocracy and the church essentially acted as the government or the ruling class or the governors of the feudal modes of production or feudal societies, and kept the working people, kept the toiling masses in line. So, there's various different ways that governments do that. Different capitalist governments are all structured very differently. But, that's not what determines if a system is capitalism. It has nothing to do with that. It's all about the relations of production, how production is carried out, who actually does the work, who actually does the labor to produce the things that society needs to continue functioning, and who profits off that labor or manages that labor while not working.
People are expected to take care of themselves with their own money. And then there's freedom to trade, freedom to own things, basically. People got a laissez-faire system. There's not a lot of government control. People can do whatever they want. Everybody's free.
The government has to enforce that, though, right? It's not just owning things, it's, owning land and capital, but capitalist governments enforce legally private property ownership. And if you try and take private property from a capitalist, the police, the government are going to come stop you. So it's not just, he's pretty non-specific about ownership. It's ownership of capital, ownership of private property. Which, when you combine capital in terms of the means of production with labor, you produce value and surplus value. But can't remember what else I was saying. Yeah, I think I said everything. It's a very specific form of ownership that then becomes legally enforced by the state. It's not just, kind of owning things and the government's kind of small, right? At least from a Marxist perspective. And he's right that there are different schools of thought that have different perspectives on what capitalism is. But the Marxist perspective is right. So
what they want. It's important to realize once you use that definition, none of us live in fully capitalist countries, right? The UK has NHS, that's not a capitalist institution. The UK has public funded education, that's not capitalist. So none of us live in a perfect capitalist system. But let's talk about capitalism, which is the idea of freedom to own, freedom to trade.
And Marx constantly talked about how class struggle can win concessions for the workers. In the Capital Volume 1, the chapter on the working day talks about this. As the workers start to organize themselves and fight for things, they're able to get concessions, and they're able to get like mini forms of socialism or social welfare within capitalism, things like the NHS in Europe, the National Healthcare Service. That doesn't mean those countries aren't capitalist, though. They're still capitalist. They're still based on capitalist relations of production. There's just social safety nets or social services put in place for the workers that the workers themselves had to fight for.
And it also means freedom to generate inequality, right? Now, there's something which is good about capitalism, which is that capitalism rewards people for doing things that other people want. So if you're making a load of paintings and nobody wants them, you're going to make no money. But if you're making a load of paintings that people want, then you are going to make money. Now, why do footballers make money in the capitalist system? Because tons of people are willing to pay to watch them. So in a sense, capitalism is good because...
And from the Marxist perspective, he says every commodity has to have a use value or it won't find a buyer on the market, right? So for the capitalist to get profit, for him to realize his capital, for him to take the product that's been produced by his workers and by his means of production and turn it into money, turn it into profit, or turn it into money which he can use to then buy more workers and more means of production. He has to sell it. He has to find a buyer for it on the market. And if it doesn't have any useful quality, if nobody thinks the commodity is useful, nobody's going to buy it. So every commodity that's produced has some kind of use value, right? The bubbler I'm drinking right now has a use value. It gives me energy because it's got 60 milligrams of caffeine.
Because it incentivizes all these people to play football and people want to watch football, these kinds of things, right? So there's like a philosophical idea behind it, which is that because everybody is free, then you will get rewarded if you do things other people want, which means in theory, people should start doing things that other people want.
There's a philosophical idea, not behind it, but that is reflected by it. The capitalist system, the capitalist relations of production, the capitalist mode of production creates its own philosophical system, its own philosophers who defend its ruling class.
Which is good because we're all helping each other. This is the idea behind it, right? The problem is, if you actually look at the outcomes of capitalism, lots of people have things which they really, really want or even need that they don't get. So we have a capitalist system, and a lot of people can't afford to feed their kids, right? So, they want to feed their kids, and there's enough food for them to feed their kids. Why are they not feeding their kids? We have people who are working jobs who are homeless. Of course they want homes, but they're not getting homes. And what this reveals.
So he's addressing the major issues of capitalism. That, while use values are being produced, ultimately they're being produced for the sake of making profit. Right? We're not producing enough use value so that everybody has a home, and we're not distributing them in a way that everyone gets a house. So while, there are enough homes, or there are more empty homes than homeless people in the US. So there are enough use values for everybody, but not everybody gets one. And again, that's a problem of distribution, but it stems from the problem of production. It stems from the relations of production. It stems from the fact that those homes are owned by the landlord class. Who accumulates more wealth via exploitation and gouging people.
Is there's one key flaw to capitalism, which is that capitalism doesn't reward you for doing what people want. Capitalism rewards you for doing what people with money want, right? There are people in poor countries in the world that are blind.
I've never heard it said like that, but that's exactly what it is.
And they just need relatively inexpensive surgery to fix their blindness, but they don't get that because they've got no money, right? So capitalism doesn't give that to those people, you're a dentist, right? You will see there are dentists that spend all of their days doing expensive cosmetic surgeries for wealthy people. And at the same time, there's people who are in agony of toothache and can't get a dentist, right? And this is because capitalism doesn't reward you for doing what people want. Capitalism rewards you for doing what people with money want.
So if you look at the American healthcare system, there's a very similar example. We have all of these specialists, right? The American healthcare system is bloated with specialists, ear, nose, and throat specialists, as well as like plastic surgeons and cosmetic surgeons and stuff like that. But that is because rich people will pay a lot of money for a specialist when they have an issue. And because, specialists make a lot of money. So there are a lot of doctors who want to be specialists rather than medical doctors, which has led us to a shortage of medical doctors and nurses. But that's where the money's at. Like he says, you're more inclined to tailor your services, to tailor healthcare towards the rich people who can pay for specialists so you can maximize your profit rather than having medical doctors who can treat homeless people or who can treat poor people or who can treat working people or people who don't have access to health insurance. Capitalism incentivizes the healthcare system to just serve the richest in society so that the capitalists at the top of it can continue to make a profit. There's no incentive to produce the use values that working people or the regular masses of society need.
If you can do something that rich people want, you can make a ton of money, right? But if you can do, if you want to provide dental work for like poor people in Africa or in Southeast Asia, you ain't going to make no money for that because they don't have any money, right? So once you understand this, then what you see is inequality is an absolute cancer at the philosophical root of capitalism. Because if you have broadly equal society, then it works, right? Because everybody has money, so you should do the thing which lots of people want. But once you have inequality, then it doesn't matter if 99% of people hate something. If you do a job which sucks wealth out of the poorest 99% and gives it to the 1%, you can get paid a ton of money for that. I know because I did it, right? Capitalism works for the people with money. There's this phrase, right, which is freedom for the heron is death for the fishes, right? If you allow everybody freedom, and what the most powerful people want is to take everything from everyone else, then that's freedom, right? That is freedom. The problem is
it's freedom for capital, right? Which is exactly how the US phrases everything. When a country that the US has colonized implements a minimum wage and like benefits for workers, they're cracking down on freedom. We need to stop this. Or when they kick out US corporations and try and invest their resources in themselves, like Bolivia or Venezuela, oh, they're cracking down on freedom. Yeah, freedom for the capitalists, freedom for the rich people, freedom for transnational corporations to invest in and control the resources and use them to make a profit. And then, once you own capital, once you own private property and you're paying wage laborers, you're going to use that to accumulate more and more wealth, right? Which means you're going to have to expand your operations. So these capitalism creates a situation where not only are you incentivized to produce things that serve the rich, like he's saying right now, but also the rich, the owning class, is accumulating more and more wealth, which gives them more and more power until there's a crash, of course, because capitalism's an incredibly unstable system. But that's why like 300 to 400 or 500 pages in Marx's Capital Volume 1 are dedicated to talking about accumulation, after he spends 500 to 700 pages talking about exploitation in the sphere of production.
Capitalism is great when you have a broad distribution. And even then, it's not necessarily great, right? If you look at, for example, the US is capitalism is great when you have a broad distribution. And even then, it's not necessarily great, right? If you look at
right, so you can't. Right, you can't have a broad distribution for the reason that I just explained. Exploitation is inherent to capitalism. Right, workers are always paid only a fraction of the value that they create, and the rest of that value goes to the capitalist as surplus, which they'll use to continue paying the workers' wages, continue paying for raw materials, the means of production, and the maintenance of their machines, their fixed capital, but also to expand production, right? And also they'll hoard some of that money away in bank accounts. They accumulate, right? So there's no way to fix this problem of distribution without doing something about the exploitation inherent in production, the sphere of production, where the workers are ripped off, which ultimately allows the capitalists to accumulate. And everywhere where the capitalists accumulate wealth, poverty accumulates among the masses.
For example, the US is a very capitalistic economy for a long period of time, right? And it had a lot of resources, so it did provide a great standard of living for a lot of people. Not if you're black, right? So if there's groups of people that don't have any wealth, then they will not get well served under capitalism. And then if you make it really unequal, then that could be 95% of people that don't get served under capitalism.
That was largely because black people were excluded from class struggle, though, which again stems from the relations of production. You have the workers, the toiling masses, who struggle against the capitalists, and they're able to get concessions. They're able to get things that capitalism, or that make capitalism appear as more equal. Now, those can be rolled back, as we've seen in the US via the last 40 years of neoliberalism. But the main reason that black people were left out of this prosperous time in America, where there really was a middle class, or you could even call it a labor aristocracy, I guess, where workers or families were able to live off one worker's income and, have a house and the white picket fence and a car and all that, was because workers got organized after the Great Depression and World War II, and they fought for that. Right? They organized into unions right after World War II. There were more wildcat strikes than any other time in America's history, because workers wanted to keep the gains that they had gotten during World War II. So these forms of class struggle incentivized politicians like FDR to give all these economic benefits to the workers that made capitalism appear as more equal. Again, the relations of production weren't changed. The ruling class remained in power and continued to accumulate, so eventually those were rolled back. But the reason that black people didn't have the same standard of living in the U.S. Was because of all sorts of factors related to systemic racism, but mostly that they were excluded from the class struggle. A lot of unions wouldn't allow black people in them at the time. And, there were even like racist segments of like communist parties in the U.S., which is really sad. But yes.
You see what I'm saying? So capitalism works philosophically, theoretically, when everybody has money, when everybody has wealth. But we're moving towards a situation. That is why capitalism works relatively well in Western Europe and did for the last 70 years, because lots of people have wealth. So capitalism is democracy, but
capitalism ain't working in Europe anymore. Look at France right now. People are out in the streets. People are storming BlackRock. People can't afford to heat their homes, even in these places where they have social welfare states and social safety nets. Capitalism isn't working anymore.
One vote. You see what I'm saying? So if everybody has equal amount of money, then everybody will get a decent amount of what they want. But once you move towards extreme inequality, then capitalism will only serve the rich. Of course it will. Why would capitalism give you anything if you have nothing to offer for it? It's about freedom of trade. And if these people have all the power, then they will get all the stuff. And what you start to see is capitalism is so dynamic, it creates the physical infrastructure to perfectly mirror the distribution of wealth, because capitalism serves the people with wealth. So if you have a broad wealth holding society, then capitalism will produce lots of middle class housing and middle class cars and middle class appliances and middle class services and middle class theatres and middle class cinemas, right? But if you have an economy where all of the wealth is with the very rich, then capitalism will give you extreme luxury and poverty. It will give you an extremely wealthy town centre surrounded by impoverished slums, which is what the case in Mumbai, which is the case in Johannesburg, is the case in Sao Paulo, is the case in every unequal country in the world, and is becoming the case.
That's a good point. And it kind of reflects like financialization. As wealth is concentrated at the top in America, who are you going to sell stuff to? A lot of time, the poor in this country, the working people in this country, 70% of them are living paycheck to paycheck. So they've got less wealth to buy back the products that they create for capital. Yeah. Noah just called me like 15 times, so I'm going to... Sorry, I just muted myself. So I'm going to text Noah back while we continue listening to this.
Here in London as well, right? So the way I see capitalism, sorry, I picked my mind, but the way I see capitalism is it produces good outcomes when everybody has wealth. When you are in a very unequal society, it generally produces terrible outcomes. So you need...
Capitalism will always create inequality because it's a system based on exploitation, because of the relations of production, which lead to accumulation. I think I've explained that pretty thoroughly at this point.
To protect the wealth distribution. You need to protect the wealth distribution. And the problem you have is that capitalism tends to destroy the wealth distribution. So I'm not saying I'm anti-capitalist. To me, I think you bring me a car and the car's not working.
I'm not saying I'm anti-capitalist. Listen, the system doesn't work. It always results in huge amounts of wealth inequality and people starving to death. But I'm not an anti-capitalist. That would be crazy. I think you might be an anti-capitalist, Gary. I think you just gotta not be afraid to say it. Not be afraid of the ruling class who's brainwashed you into thinking that this is the only system that works. Because the other thing about capitalism, does when wealth accumulates and concentrates at the top, it allows that ruling class, the capitalist class, to control the education system, to control the media, to control the government that we were talking about before, to, in many ways, not only control the production of physical goods, material goods, as well as services, but also control intellectual production. It allows them to control what we see, what we consume, the kind of information that we have available to us. So it brainwashes us into thinking that this is the only system that could ever work. So you can understand, a lot of the systemic problems with capitalism and then be like, well, I'm not an anti-capitalist though, because we've been trained to think that it's crazy to be an anti-capitalist. It's crazy to recognize the flaws in society and try to alleviate those flaws, try to change them together. Which, of course, it's not crazy. It's entirely rational to want to do that if you're not one of these insanely wealthy people who capitalism is working for, as he's explained. But yeah, this isn't a bad video. I hope I'm not coming off as like trying to dunk on this Gary economics guy. Like, it's not a terrible video. I'm just explaining the Marxist position, the Marxist scientific analysis of capitalism. That starts from the relations of production, starts from the sphere of production where things are produced, and then, uses, after a thorough analysis of that, moves on to accumulation, which leads to concentration and wealth inequality, which he's talking about.
Working. I'm not going to tell you I'm anti-cars. I have studied this system. It is broken in a specific way that I think is fixable. I know there'll be people out there and say, no, the capitalism is broken. You need to destroy it. We need to bring it in. Okay, that's fine. Show me the blueprint for the new society. I'll have a look. At the moment.
So that's the thing about scientific socialism. It understands that any new society that we're going to bring about has to come about, or has to be built from the existing society. So it's not, as he said, just wipe out capitalism and lay the blueprint for a new utopian society. And this is what Engels' book, Utopian and Scientific, is about. saying, all right, let's look at capitalism and how can we transition into a society that's not broken, into a society that's run by the workers, and ultimately a society that's not based on exploitation, a society where there's no owning class and no working class. But it's a process of transition, right? The end goal of capitalism is to abolish class exploitation, to abolish class society. But you can't do that overnight, right? So like socialists and communists in America, yes, our long-term goal is to abolish class society, but like if socialists were to take power tomorrow, we would have a list of things that we would want to implement. Things like universal health care, which he mentioned, things like ending the war, investing in infrastructure, investing in new jobs, investing in retirement and people's pensions, social security, stuff like that. So that would be part of a transition to socialism, to a more socialistic economy. And then, certain industries would have to be nationalized, and the process of socialist construction would continue from there. But you're taking the capitalist system and building alleviating its issues, getting rid of its problems, and then eventually trying to get transitioning to a society that abolishes the core problem, the problem at the center of capitalism, the relations of production between capitalist and wage labor, which leads to exploitation and accumulation. So not just starting over with a brand new society, building a new society, which is the work of history and the work of the future after the working class takes power of the society and the government.
I don't want to prevent this disaster from happening. And it's the problem we have right now is what is most frustrating is the problem is so fixable. The problem is so fixable. It is a problem with the wealth distribution. We fix the.
It's not, though. It's not. As long as the capitalists dominate production, that wealth distribution is always going to be off. I mean, it is a problem of distribution too. It is a problem with the sphere that also relates to the sphere of circulation. And some of those things can be controlled, but yeah, you need to give workers more control at the point of production too.
The wealth distribution, we fix the problem, we can see a massive increase in living standards, a massive increase in living standards. You don't fix the wealth distribution, you won't fix the living standards. So for me, you need to protect the distribution. And we're not doing it. And like, if people want to have a discussion about what is the ideal system, is capitalism the best system? Could we have other systems? We can have that discussion. But at the moment, the system that we have is falling off of a cliff. And I would prefer to prevent that disaster from happening first. Because if we don't do anything about what's happening now, it's going to be real, real bad. It's going to be real, real bad. And
that's what's going to trigger a revolution of the working masses, who will then construct a new system. As capitalism gets worse and worse, as Marx said, it sows the seeds of its own destruction until the working class, who are a part of the capitalist system, right? Because change, the dialectical philosophy says that change comes from within something, not from outside of it. The workers from within capitalism take power of it and can turn it into a new system. But unfortunately, a lot of times things have to get real bad before that happens, which is why we got to organize and educate people and get after it.
There's this phrase, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're in a situation, but I would say don't let the perfect be the enemy of preventing the collapse of society at this point. That's what we're looking at. That's what we're looking at. So listen, let's fix the problem that we have, and then we can talk about it.
It doesn't have to be a collapse. If we allow capitalism to keep going because it's inherently a system that leads to crises, it'll continue to collapse, and then the government will bail out the capitalists and things will get worse for the workers. But if there was a workers' revolution, we'll sublate capitalism. We'll transform it into something new, keep the good parts about it and get rid of the bad parts. Sublation is the dialectical word for a transformation into something new based on contradictions, conflict within the thing. So based on that class struggle between workers and capitalists, the system can be sublated and transformed into something new. It doesn't have to be a collapse. Capitalism will continue to collapse on its own so long as it's allowed to keep going.
Is there a better way to do this? Is there a better way to do this? But listen, I'm not a philosopher, I just don't want things to be really, really shit, and they're going to be.
Well, that's why we're here, Gary. That's why Midwestern Marx Institute is here. Because people like you don't want society to be really shitty, and we got the philosophy to help.
We can stop them if we fix the distribution.
interesting stuff. I don't know if someone sent me that video. I want to say someone sent that in the Discord. But I thought it was very interesting. I had a feeling it would be something like that, where he boils the issues with capitalism down to a problem of distribution. And there are issues with the distribution of goods under capitalism, but they're all tied to issues at the point of production.